Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, the politics, and the policies that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Derek Cohen, who's the Vice President of Policy at TPPF. And today we have a very special guest. We don't always have guests here, but from time to time, we like to bring people in to get their perspectives. Our guest today is Brad Johnson. He is a senior reporter at the Texan. He covers all things Texas legislature, all things Texas, really. And you can find his stories at thetexan.news. And I'll go ahead and, as a point of privilege, go ahead and tell everybody to subscribe to the Texan. It's a fantastic news outlet, and I've been a subscriber since the very first day. So I've enjoyed your work, Brad, for sure. So thank you for coming, and appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We're coming up on our 4-year anniversary next month, and it's exciting to see, how much we're getting into the legislature, how the reputation we've gained, large part thanks to you guys, having us use your experts for stories and whatnot. Sure. So we appreciate it.
Well, that's great, and I'm sure there was not a few people, a few people who were rooting against you guys, because you're definitely right of center. Although your editor in chief, Connie Burton, of course, was a very conservative senator in the legislature. But I always liked that her the reason why she wanted to start the magazine in the first place, or the online outlet, was because that the center right viewpoint was not prevalent in Texas media, of all places, and that you didn't have to open up something and read an article every single day that contradicted your particular viewpoint every single time. Talk a little bit about the philosophy behind getting started.
Well, Connie's not the editor-in-chief, and that's
I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's important because from the very beginning, she was adamant that there be no opinion. And of course, if you see Connie on Twitter, she's slinging opinions left and right. But there's very much a firewall. She doesn't handle day-to-day content on things, and she's off, advocating for whatever policy she believes in and trying to sell a Texan. But the view from the very beginning was a fact-based news organization that doesn't spit on the worldview of most Texans. Right. And I think we've done that. Like you said, we're right of center. Everyone that works there is at right of center, if not, more conservative. And I think it's been quite successful. We get not just conservatives talking to us. We have Democrats all the time. I was interviewing Harold Dutton yesterday on the floor of the House, and it's been quite a ride. And we made a lot of progress. And
of course, you've been there since the very beginning, and so you've been covering the Texas legislature for a long time, Derek.
Well, the only thing I would add is, yes, while you guys are acknowledge your priors, which I think we could stand to see a little bit more in the Texas media. Y'all play it pretty much straight down the fairway. I mean, as far as when it comes to things that are reported, and then maybe it's just my own bias and fish not knowing he's wet, it doesn't seem like you're pushing it one way or the other, right or left. You are just resuscitating or regurgitating facts and putting those into applied context, not necessarily saying, and this is why this bill needs to die, or this is the worst or best thing since sliced bread, or whatever the case might be.
When I started this, I'd never done journalism. I didn't go to school for journalism, and I found that I was frustrated.
Why you didn't end up as a leftist, I guess.
Right? Yeah, yes, probably, yeah. I started with the same kind of frustration with media that most right-of-center people have because of what the media generally is. And I found it to be really interesting how easy it is to just play things down the fairway. That's not to say there aren't difficult parts of the job. Covering the legislature when everything is happening, it's like drinking from a fire hose. But I don't find it really that difficult to keep most of my priors out of this. Obviously, the bias comes in what stories that we choose to cover, because you can't cover everything. But we also, like you said, we acknowledge our priors, and that's something most media does not do. When there's a very clear prior bias there.
And that's a good segue to later in the show. I definitely want to get to some of the stories that don't get as much coverage in the so-called corporate press or mainstream media or whatever. I think you guys do a really good job of doing that. And in particular, I think you find those stories, on legislation that's moving through the Capitol on big issues that we don't always hear about. So while we have 15 seconds left of the shameless plug portion of the show, we'll remind our folks that if you want to get in touch with us, Derek and I love the feedback, the constructive criticism, even some of the hate out there on social media. Again, I'm at Real BPhil on Twitter, and Derek is at Cohen at TPPF on Twitter. So send us your show ideas or feedback or criticism, whatever you have. I'll also plug probably our best newsletter that we have is our weekly newsletter. If you can pick it up at texaspolicy.com/thepost, texaspolicy.com/thepost. It's a weekly newsletter of all the things that we're working on, all the big issues that are going on, all the commentaries and things that we have. And I also write an exclusive piece for that, so you can only get it there. So that's texaspolicy.com/thepost. All right, guys. We're going to get right into the legislature and what's going on this week. Derek, you usually do a pretty good wrap-up for us in terms of your Lege-Land update that we like to call. So give us kind of your top items for the week.
Well, I have to say the biggest item of note was probably the absence of something. And that would be the absence of the Sturm and Drang around the gender modification bill in the Senate. So we saw on Monday that it was heard in House Public Health, the hearing that went to midnight, and then it was whistled done. And obviously the attending shenanigans that surrounded that, die-ins and whatnot. But that being said, is
drum circles, die-ins, DJs, all the crazy shenanigans.
I don't know about y'all, but I always tell my folks that when they're advocating at the Capitol, it helps to have a DJ. But that's my take. But no, seriously.
But does he take requests? That's really the key. Is if you're going to get your bill heard.
Yeah, well, he's kind of in this weird experimental phase, and so there's a lot of like weird drops,
A lot of mashups.
Yeah, we can go with that.
He just overdoes it way too much.
Yeah, exactly. The crescendo beat and all that. That's what people tune in for our jokes about DJs. But that being said, we had all this production on Monday, and I was like, well, here we go. Who's gonna fall on the grenade and do the several hour filibuster in the Senate? Mm-hmm. Not only did nobody filibuster in the Senate, they did not even talk about it. The bill was not even before the Senate for more than an hour. The bill was
no debate on the bill.
Well, I mean, there was an airing of grievances, I think would be fair to say, but there was no substantive back and forth. It was more kind of I would say microwaving the talking points we heard in the committee hearing, and then those we heard in the committee hearing on Monday. And it's these things that Dr. Campbell was very resolute in defending, and it came and went without so much as a whimper. Now that we also see that over in the House side, they're actually starting to advance bills. We had bills engrossed in the House already. And in that case, it was, these were some ones that have moved quickly through committees. One fairly non-controversial. I don't know, unless you have a Diwali fireworks business or have a real pronounced take on it.
I think there were 2 no votes on that yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah, because that and Texas honey as well.
That was actually an interesting fight.
Well, okay. And Brad, actually, I would love to get your take on this, because this is what I found incredibly interesting. So there was HB 300, which is basically takes certain maternal items and now adult items, incontinence items, and takes a sales tax off of that. That's got well north of $100 million a year fiscal note. That's not a nothing fiscal note, but that kind of came and went on Tuesday, the first day it was on the floor. And then the one that actually elicited the most debate and the most discussion was whether or not how we're labeling honey that's made in Texas, whether it was blended or true Texas honey and stuff. And I that juxtaposition I found quite baffling. Similarly?
Yeah, I mean the whole slate of 4 bills it was on the first day, Tuesday, nothing was really that controversial. But the honey bill was the most controversial. It eventually got 16 no votes. But the fight was over. Are you guys familiar with champagne and how actual champagne only comes from a certain part in France, and everything else is just a knockoff.
Sure.
Well, it's like that. Only
You
with
could have said
Texas honey.
bourbon though, like too. Like we could.
I guess, yeah. I'm not sure if there's the
Stay on this side of the pond, Brad.
I'm not sure if there's the regulatory behemoth behind the bourbon lobby as there is the champagne lobby, but it's like that only with Texas honey. Are vendors allowed to mix any bit of out-of-state honey into their mostly Texas honey for it to be qualified as that? And there were at least a few representatives in the House that very much disagreed with that. And Representative Bales was the one who advanced the bill. He was saying this is about fairness. It's obviously going to help some people and hurt others in the industry. Where do you come down on that? But I like those kinds of fights, especially over more esoteric, type of topics.
It stings.
Oh, you went there, of course. Oh, good Lord. Okay, so what do you make? I mean, Derek makes a good point. I mean, you had, every single publication in Texas has written about the gender mod bill, and all of them, I think, have opposed the bill. All of them are using the Democrat talking points about it leading to, to kids committing suicide, or how it's, eliminating transgenders, or it's anti-LGBT. You have this huge, the media cares so much about this, and the left wing cares so much about this. And then, of course, the members all vote no, but there's no debate. When it comes time to actually go to the floor and to make the case as a legislator in front of the people of Texas, there's nothing. Like, how does that happen?
Well, first of all, I expect some more floor opposition in the House just because it's naturally more chaotic. But also, if I saw correctly, the anti-SB whatever crowd got actually a bit of a compromise, which was grandfathers in anyone currently getting these treatments. And so as far as anyone showing up to testify at the committee or sending emails to the senators about this, they would all be exempt from this prohibition. It would just be for people going forward once it passes.
Yeah, which actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it, though, because, Campbell's whole case on this, one I largely agree with, is that this is unvetted experimental medicine. Well, so too would be, going cold turkey on a run of hormones or a run of medication. So it kind of makes sense because they're going to have to pump the brakes, but they can't slam on the brakes, as it were.
All right. Well, moving on to kind of a similar issue. Also in the Senate this week, we passed out, or the Senate passed out, protecting women's sports and not letting males play in women's sports.
Interesting vote sheet on that.
Was it though? I mean, I thought it wasn't 19 to 12 like the rest of them.
No, I believe you had, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brad, but I think we had 3 Democrats go white light on that.
I was not following that vote. It's not my issue. But I would not be surprised because we saw crossover appeal for it last time around with the elementary through high school version.
Again, not a huge debate. There wasn't a big floor. There's certainly no filibusters or anything like this. Are these types of issues? Maybe you call them cultural. I don't know. Are the Democrats just not wanting to fight these issues anymore? I mean, there's literally no discussion about the abortion issue right now either, right? I mean, after everything that happened with the last, with the Supreme Court and the last election and all of that, and a lot of, frankly, left-wing organizations taking credit for the Republicans not doing as well as they should have done because of the abortion issue in the last election, and yet here we are in Texas, kind of ground zero for whether or not states are going to be able to make their own rules about abortion, and you don't hear this at all. Are the Democrats waving the white flag, Brad, on cultural issues?
Well, as the minority party, you have to pick and choose what you go to the mat over. What did they do last session? Elections, the election reform bill, and they killed it with the quorum break, 2 quorum breaks. Eventually it passed, but the biggest issue I think that Democrats will go to the mat on is school choice, and that hasn't come up yet. It's about to come out of committee. It may have just come out of committee, so we'll see that on the floor of the Senate soon. But the big question is in the House, and do Republicans even support that? Democrats have a much stronger position in the House on that. So,
Derek, the women's sports bill.
Yeah, the women's sports bill. Like I said, we had three white lights on that, and I think in this actually I'd like to piggyback a little bit on what Brad said because I think they're interrelated. Is that you had the walkout that what I believe in my reading of the data had redound not to the political success of the Democrats going forward. Obviously, it was it was kind of, the red wave that wasn't, we talked about that in particular narrative. But that being said, is, a lot of these Democrats took a lot of flack for this. And the rules that were passed when they came back, or the rules that we have currently for the floor, are punitive for that sort of behavior. And so I think we're going to actually see that discouraged from this particular time. Now, specifically on school choice, though, I will say that one thing that I'm cautious of, because they passed it out so quickly, is SB 10, which obviously is the COLA adjustment for the teachers.
Teacher pay. Right.
Yeah, and look, if that's moving, I think it's good policy and politics if that were moving with alongside SB 8. Mm-hmm. But that being said, if 10 goes and 8 doesn't, I think that you are going to have a lot of people very upset for a lot of different reasons.
Brad, it's interesting that you bring up school choice, which we're contractually obligated to do as to EPPF every single 11 minutes, I think is what it is.
I'll check the employee handbook. I believe it's down to 9.
And not just school choice, but I mean the whole parent empowerment bill. I mean the Parents' Bill of Rights, which kind of gets to my point, is that fundamentally this debate is about something different than it was 4 years ago or 5 or 6 years ago. Certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, certain 2 or 3 years, this issue has a new dynamic. It's not just about choice. It's not just about fairness, to be able to choose where your kids goes to school. The last 3 years, through the pandemic and everything else, parents are starting to see what's going on in schools, and I won't necessarily take you through our whole narrative again, but we all know that especially with what we saw like in the Virginia governor's race, I mean, parents are angry about what's going on in the schools. They didn't know all this gender ideology and CRT were being pushed on their kids. Then when they start to push back, now all of a sudden they're getting, their mics cut off and they're getting arrested. I mean, the dynamic has completely changed, and it's no longer about, private school interests or private interests versus the teachers and the public schools and all of that. It's about parents and about what parents want versus what the education establishment wants to keep control over. I mean, that's really what the real debate is over right now. And so you have this growing block on, of left, right, independent, doesn't matter, but their parents now saying it's us versus the education establishment, which is a very different dynamic. Do the Democrats, I mean, is that something? I mean, do they not, number one, do they not realize that the dynamic has changed or do they not care? And they're still willing to shut down, the legislature and become the anti-parent party in order to defend the interests of the public schools?
Well, teachers unions especially are very strong on the political left. They hold a lot of sway. The dynamic, though, has definitely changed. I think the dam-breaking moment, though, was school closures during the pandemic. Now, all this other cultural stuff is definitely part of it, and it's part of further pushing the momentum. But the fact that many schools closed or masked kids upset a ton of parents, and I think that really got the ball rolling on it. We saw homeschooling skyrocket, and that has just continued when you throw in the more curriculum type of aspects to this. But I think that's really what got the ball rolling, not only in Texas but elsewhere. And we saw that in Virginia, on top of all the other cultural
They're
stuff.
likely to pass a school choice bill or some kind of bill out of the Senate SB 8. Likely this happen this week. And then it moves over to the House, so we'll talk a little bit about the House. What issues are you guys seeing in the House? What are the top issues, Derek, do you see in the House being debated right now, either in the committees or I guess the floor is not having a whole lot of action right now. Honey, notwithstanding the great honey debate of 2023. But what's going on?
We'll tell our kids we were there for that.
But what big issues are going on in the House that we need to keep an eye on?
Well, in the House, and I mentioned this last week, I believe the House is moving with the most alacrity in the realm of technology. We've seen both HB4 be set for, I believe it's next Monday.
Data privacy.
Yeah, which is data privacy, and it's also the first item that qualifies as major state, which just kind of gives it preferential hearing amongst second reading bills. We have HB 18, which is data privacy for protecting minors online, and we've seen that moving fast as well. Now that has not necessarily been voted out of committee, and just in the kind of the general committee world, we haven't really necessarily seen these big themed hearings. the chairs seem to be taking the requests almost as they come in. So I know, for example, in criminal jurisprudence where I was on Tuesday, it was everything from forfeiture to marijuana to the rogue prosecutors and things like that. So it was all over the place. And then bail, of course, because can't have a session without bail.
You can't take our property or our weed. All the same. All the same hearing.
Or you'll have to put it down to get out of jail. So, but all that to say is there's less of a coherent at a committee level push on any one particular things. Obviously, we've seen property taxes advance in both chambers. Mm-hmm. And that's still going to be a point of contention. I think, we can go into that a little bit later too. But as far as speaker priorities, I would say definitely tech. But then I would also highlight, because you want to talk about interesting politics, the Reader Act. Mm-hmm. That basically
keeping the porn books out of schools.
Yeah,
right.
And so when that was debated, we saw Democrats, not only vote for the bill, it was 10-2 in committee, but we also saw them publicly take a stand in support of it. Sean Terry being most notable, in public pushing back, and that really shows that there is a limit to what individuals are going to tolerate on behalf of some of these entities, and I think that's going to be one of the issues where we're going to see interesting splits. I don't think. And don't tell David Dunmoyer this. I don't think tech is going to be that interesting because most people are already there.
Yeah.
He mentioned this morning that it had something on the order of 74 co-authors.
Yeah. Well, that's almost a majority. So
yeah, I'm like, well, that sure beats having to do a whip count, and so it's going to be on major states. So.
Brad, in the House, major issues, but also want to get your thoughts on anything that might be sort of under the radar that you want to highlight that you're covering.
Well, first I'll say that the House is generally slower, bigger body, more moving parts, and so on. But
stank
also
leadership,
yes. But also, they lead on the budget this year, and so that's actually scheduled for Thursday. So while last session the Senate did that first, and then we had Budget Day in the House later on, it's all happening now, and so I think that's taking some of the oxygen away from other stuff that we'll see later. The Reader Act was definitely interesting. Oscar Longoria, who is a joint author on the bill, pushed back on, or basically, in an indirect way, pushed back on James Tallarico and his comments during that committee hearing. I think one under-the-radar issue that I'm going to be following a lot, and I have no idea how it's going to turn out in the House, is this local debt situation, specifically the Amarillo, where they passed $260 million of spending through this weird route that was not intended for that.
The revenue anticipation notes?
Yes. Yeah. And that was after voters rejected their proposal. House members, Drew Darby was one, got really outraged by that when they heard this in committee over interim.
Yeah, just to catch our viewers up, we've done some. I actually did one of my personal podcasts. There's another shameless plug for Brian's Breakdown. I actually interviewed Alex Fairley, who was the activist who really brought this to the fore very quickly. Voters rejected $260 million bond to borrow that money for taxpayers to have to pay back. Voters rejected that for the purpose of some convention center or something like that. And then the city council or the city government basically used this archaic loophole in the law for them to essentially go through and get the money anyway. Alex Fairley and others thought that was an abuse of power, went and fought it, and eventually won, I think, in the courts, won in the courts. But because it became a hubbub, Alex brought it to the legislature and angered several members of the state legislature that Amarillo would do something like that, because if they did that and they were successful, every single city government would get the message, and then it would be, well, we don't even have to ask the taxpayers for hundreds of millions of dollars anymore. Yeah. We can just go get it done.
I wonder where TML is going to fall on that.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing about that issue, the court didn't rule that they couldn't do that. They ruled that they didn't follow the proper procedure to do it. And so the legislature, if they're going to prevent this down the road, they have to pass a law to prohibit it.
Yeah, good point.
So another, it's not exactly low on the totem pole, but I think it's getting less examination than it should, is this power grid situation. That is a massive point of contention between the two chambers. Senate's advancing their slate, which does a whole bunch of different things. It's way too lengthy to go into detail on. But the big hiccup, I think, will be SB 6 and how much money do we...
You got to tell people what that is.
Sorry. Yeah. SB 6, which would create this insurance program to specifically finance about 10,000 megawatts of natural gas generation. And there are arguments that is basically anti-free market. And I think we'll see that especially take root in the House. As we saw kind of last session, the House was opposed to the Berkshire Hathaway plan, which was fairly similar. The government specifically picking this group to build generation. That didn't go anywhere. This is the option this session, or one of the options. I don't really know what the House is going to do on that, but once again, we're back talking about the power grid after we spent 22 hours in committee hearing on this issue last session.
Yeah, and to put a fine point on that too, it's a lot of the consternation about that specifically is because of the nature of Texas' deregulated market. Most of the country has some form of a capacity market, and we've deliberately stepped away from that. And obviously, there's times where it's not great or where it hasn't been great, obviously. But overall, it's worked for us. This level of subsidy would kind of question, well, are we just going to pivot back to a capacity market? And I think that's where some of the consternation in the House is going to come from. Interesting, though, I haven't heard much yet. And I say much yet, I mean, that doesn't mean that these conversations haven't been going on. Mostly, I'll go to Brad to see if he's written about it. But I haven't heard much on what the House is altering. Obviously, there's still an appetite for grid repair, grid reform, whatever form it comes in. However, I think that, again, it's one of those issues. I'm not going to say irreconcilable, but it's definitely one where the chambers are miles apart upon.
And it is, and it's so complicated. Yeah. I mean, the average Texan, I tell our folks all the time. It's almost like property tax, which we haven't talked about, and we're going to get to in just a second. But it's like one of those issues where it's just so complicated that the average Texan can't really wrap their head around it. They just know the lights got to come on when I hit the switch, and it can't cost me, as much as my mortgage in order for me to get the lights on. So however they fix it, though that needs to be the result is that it's got to work. The good news is, I think, particularly here in Texas, is that we're eminently reasonable, and of course all the polling shows that what we want is reliable, affordable energy, and that means that we have to have fossil fuels. And generally, people in Texas aren't as anti-fossil fuel as they are in, say, other states like California and New York, and so we don't have as much of a push to get rid of fossil fuels, right? I mean, people are still supportive of renewables, and certainly Texas is frankly a leader in renewable generation, but you don't have this pressure coming from the public to eliminate fossil fuels, and so that seems to be part of what the typical back and forth debate is about. We don't have that here, so we can actually argue over the policies that ultimately matter. I do want to get into property tax for a little bit, but I want to start with the politics because we don't really get to talk about that too much here. Yeah. You report on it incessantly, and so that's good. There's obviously a huge gap between what the Senate is talking about, what the House is talking about. The Lieutenant Governor has been very vocal in terms of what he's supporting. They've passed their property tax bill. Yep. Senator Betancourt they've moved their actual bills and they've made progress. You've got the Speaker in this week, I think actually yesterday or the day before, was in the Houston Chronicle. I mean, put an op-ed in the Houston Chronicle making the case for appraisal caps. So tell me a little bit about the divide, I guess, Brad, and take us through the politics of that.
Well, it is a huge divide, but it's on a minor part of the overall property tax plan. There's not a lot of daylight between the two sides on compression, which is the state buying down local rates. Not a lot of divide on that. The big divide is on appraisals, and how do you address that? The House wants to establish a 5% appraisal cap for all property. Currently, the 10% cap, year-to-year cap, only applies to homesteads. And so that would be, that's a pretty big change in the way things currently operate. The Senate, on the other side, wants to continue doing what they have done last session and the one before with increasing the homestead exemption. Now that only applies to people who own homes, right? But on the business side, what the Senate has decided to do is increase the business personal property tax exemption from $2,500 to $25,000, and then create this inventory tax credit. So 2 very different strategies to address the same general issue. And I think this is, I don't think they'll go to a special session on this, because I think they'll hammer it out maybe at the expense of other things that will cause a special session. But
see, that perturbs me a little bit, because the more they argue about it, the bigger the number gets.
Yeah.
Right. Like when the budget came out, it was $15 billion, and the Senate came out, it was $16 billion. The House came out at $17 billion. I mean, a couple special sessions, we might be at $20 billion.
Hey, there's some who would want that, right?
Oh no.
It's I mean, the lieutenant governor is very bullish on this, and he's called the House plan not exactly irresponsible, but he's basically alluded to that, saying that this is not the way to do it. We've seen problems come from this appraisal cap strategy in California. The House counters with, you're just allowing homesteads to benefit from this appraisal cap when businesses pay so much money, and we see their appraisals rise and their tax bills rise commensurately with the appraisal. And so why should they not benefit from this kind of limitation? And then, as you mentioned, the speaker comes out yesterday, and he did not pull any punches in that. He had not come out as forcefully as the lieutenant governor to that point, but I think that was pretty forceful, and they're not giving any ground on this.
And now, Derek, the easy question: who's right?
Yes. I don't like it when mommy and daddy fight. But no, all that to say,
but it's so entertaining for people in my business.
Right? Exactly. We just want the right policy.
No, and to be honest with you, I see the merits in both arguments. But to your point, Brian, I think that they need to be careful insofar as if this is what. I mean, obviously, this has already led to some, anti-other chamber animus, and so I think that we really need to that the chambers leaderships need to be careful on this particular thing to make sure that, to Brad's point, it does get hammered out. And if it does get up to $20 billion, then we'll just have to bear that burden.
Yeah.
But that being said, is obviously then we start getting into the realm of it. Does this count as spending? Because we have to basically bribe the drunken sailors down at the local level to basically go, no, we'll cover some of the tax that is owed to you, but it doesn't do anything about their spending. That's one thing I would highlight that nobody's really talking about. Is just this, if we agree that we want to do compression, which seems like both chambers do, neither of which has really had a very strong statement on getting the local spending under control. And, this is, we talk about this when taxpayer funded lobbying comes up. We talk about this when when the revenue anticipation note issues comes up. They're advocating at the Capitol, and nobody's trying to put them back in a box. And that's what I think is irresponsible, really, is that neither chamber's really addressing that while having compression as part of their package.
And when it comes down to it, I mean, and not to be the comms guy here and get on message here, but at the end of the day, we talk to Texans all over, and the 3 things they want is, number one, they like that it's the largest property tax cut in history. That's fine and grand, and all the politicians can pat themselves on the back and take credit for that, which is a legitimate success. But the other 2 things are really important, is that, one, taxpayers actually have to be able to feel it, right? And they don't necessarily need a $1,000 cut in the first year, but they need to know that it's not going up, and they need to know that it's at least going down somewhat in the first year and then continuing to go down after that. And then 3, we can't be back here in 5 years. We have to fix it. This can't be a situation where we're fighting tooth and nail to get this big property tax cut, and then we all cut a ribbon somewhere, and then in 5 years we're like, what the heck happened?
And absent control at the local level, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Right. And so we got to get our
or
hands
changing
around
the system entirely. It's not cutting into the maintenance and operation rate itself long term. It will buy it down by probably a pretty substantial amount for the next biennium. But then, do you come back and have to reapply that money? Yeah, you would. Otherwise, property tax bills will go back up.
Yep.
Is the state going to be in the same economic situation in 2 years?
Well, and we're going to get tired of this. I mean, taxpayers are at some point going to get too tired of it and then become voters and then make their voice known. One issue that is the number one issue for voters, and I know this isn't necessarily a beat, but border security is still the number one issue in Texas by a mile. Even when you take into account all the other issues that we talk about, education, school safety, all of that, by a mile, Texans left, right, and center all believe that the border and its connection to public safety are the biggest issue. I know you're not necessarily covering that, but what are you kind of hearing and seeing on issues like that up at the Capitol?
There is not a lot of opposition to the general plan. There's some criticism of specific things, like should Operation Lone Star be down there as much as they are for as long as they've been. But the idea of appropriating more money to this is not really something I've seen draw a lot of criticism. Mm-hmm. It's more of what you do with it. Mm-hmm. I think so,
like the border force and all of that. And
right.
People, the left came out pretty hard and saying, this is going to be stormtroopers kicking in grandma's house and deporting her or whatever, which of course is nonsense. But they did, but you're absolutely right. It's not the money; it's the how it's used. Yeah. And the left is coming pretty, almost to threatening special sessions and things like that.
One idea I heard from Representative Terry Canales at our event that we hosted was to focus on these ports of entries and securing those specifically because, you see the story of the truck that overturned in San Antonio, killed 40 some odd people. He is of the belief that is a better way to prevent illegal border crossings. Now, what do you do about the massive stretches of land that have no barrier whatsoever? Texas is trying to build some sort of barrier across this massive landline. So I think it is going to eventually, Democrats are going to kind of compromise on this. What that means, I don't know, but they'll try and get something out of it. And they see the way the political winds are moving in South Texas. It's not as if Democrats are about to be eradicated there, but Republicans are making really strong gains there. Mm-hmm. It's unavoidable at this point. And so, you see Ryan Guillen flip parties last year or in 21, and the writing is on the wall that Democrats need a different tact on the border. And we saw as much in the after action report by the Texas Democratic Party after 2022, when throughout the rest of the country, Democrats did pretty well. But in Texas, they didn't come close to taking statewide. They kept 2 of the 3 congressional offices down in South Texas, but those 2 were very, if you look at the partisan leaning, heavily Democratic. It would have been a massive shock for a Republican to take those. Yeah. And so I think they're gonna move some way on this, and it's not gonna be the hill to die on that maybe it has been in the past.
Derek, next week is going to be April. And so we'll have less than 2 months technically of regular session left,
but who's counting?
It hasn't really, exactly. But it hasn't really been much debate on the number one issue. There's at least enough, maybe some debate, but not enough attention on legislative vehicles or what the state legislature can do to try and assert some authority down there at the border. What's going to happen?
Well, there's definitely but I have to pivot back to Brad's earlier point that a lot of the work that we're seeing is Senate focusing on its priorities and getting some of the major things out, and the House just being slower as a matter of function. Now, I can speak knowledgeably about several of the suggestions that are in play. And, these are the ones that are actually fairly technical because there's a lot of federal preemption when it comes to different types of border and immigration enforcement. So, like, things like that have to do with Texas to Mexico, but, like the Texas angle list, very similar to what we have federally. We also have suggestions, just running the idea of an invasion, which would free up...
Invasion declaration so that it can open up new authorities for the governor.
Yeah, it would open up new authorities specifically on our side of the border in enforcement. And all these things are things that need to be incredibly vetted by attorneys. And, I know for a fact that them coming out of Ledge Council took a lot longer than other things coming out of Ledge Council, which take a long time to begin with, just because of how highly technical they are and needing extra set of eyes or three sets of eyes or 4 or whatever the case might be. And so those will have their day, but those right now are also getting sent to some of the House committees that are also, overburdened. For example, if we put a lot of stock in some of that stuff, like in Homeland Security and Public Safety, which oversees a lot of the law enforcement function in the state, you're also going to see all the gun bills go there. And so that split up into now 2 committees where you have Homeland Security and Public Safety and then Community Safety. And so most of the gun bills are now in community safety. And so the problem is, though, is that they share a lot of personnel between the two. And so there's only a finite amount of time in a day that Chairman Guillen, who Brad mentioned, can sit and hear bills during. And so that tends to be just, once we're starting to run out of daylight, or not that it ever stops them because they keep going past dark. But that being said is, it's a priority. I don't think it's been deprioritized by any of this lack of movement or perceived lack of movement. I think it's making sure all the, all the T's are crossed and lowercase j's dotted so that, there's no trouble subsequently.
So once we finally see bills and once we see them go through committees, it may pick up faster than we think.
Exactly. And to Brad's point, I don't think we're going to see all that much of a fight on the floor on it.
So in the last 10 minutes of our show, Brad, normally we do a segment we call In Depth, where we go in depth into a particular issue or particular to kind of break through the ins and outs and all the details and all the sausage making of something. But while you're here, I wanted to talk a little bit about Texas media. Maybe spend the last 10 minutes kind of getting your perspective on that, and just to kind of set the stage. I mean, it's no surprise that most of the larger media outlets in Texas, whether they be television stations or certainly our newspapers, are still sort of are left of center, if not off dyed-in-the-wool liberals, particularly the editorial pages, and so all of that still continues to have a leftward slant. Yeah. Again, we talked about most of the news not writing from a perspective that wouldn't offend our worldview as we look through it. So I want to kind of get your perspective just generally as a reporter, and having done this now, having come from not being a reporter, having any formal education at least, in that, to now having done this for 4 years, and you're right in the thick of it, and reporting on some of the biggest issues in the country, frankly, because Texas and what we do here is one of the most important states in the country. Just to get your perspective on, take a step back and say, what is it? What is your perspective of Texas media and kind of how it contributes or hurts or detracts from these policy debates?
Well, I mean, obviously there's a problem, and that applies to media overall, not just Texas. If there was no problem in legacy media, we would have no constituency. I would not have a job. I would not have moved to Texas. This would not be a thing. Having worked in this for 4 years, I see a lack of competitiveness, I think, between legacy outlets. They often get pretty buddy with each other. That's not to say I'm not going around calling my peers nasty things, but we are the competition. We are the ideological competition for the legacy media. I'm glad you mentioned the editorial boards. I think the Tribune does not have an editorial board. They don't put out these opinion pieces.
Not anymore. They used to have Trip Talk, and then they got rid of it a couple years ago.
They don't put out opinion pieces? Explain that.
I'll let you handle that. But like these city papers, they have these editorial boards that come out very strongly on positions, and it does the actual reporting a disservice. Like if you're a reporter in that newsroom and you see the editorial board come out with, like if I'm covering property taxes and my editor comes out and says that the House's plan is horrible or the Senate's plan is the worst thing ever, that discredits all the reporting I've done. So
it makes it tough for you to get into the lieutenant governor's office and talk to their comms guy too.
Right. Even if I've done everything right. And yeah, exactly, that too. So when we started, Connie was very adamant about not doing opinion, and that has not happened at all. And I think it's a big reason why we get people from both sides of the political aisle talking to us, in addition to, in my opinion, how well we actually do the job. As far as other things in the media, I think there is very much, it's difficult to make money. And we see this increasing shift towards nonprofits. And that has its advantages. You can bring in a lot of money in a short amount of time to build up an apparatus quickly. We chose the other routes. Connie and Phil just funded this from the beginning, and then we're subscriber funded outside of that. And so that's a different route. It takes longer to get up to the level of staffing that, say, the Tribune has. But it forces you to figure out the correct way to do things, right? You have to be efficient. You have to be quick on your toes. You have to be high quality. Otherwise, people are not going to read you. You're not going to get subscriptions. And it's been really eye-opening being in the thick of it and seeing what the people that do my job every day, how they conduct themselves, seeing people going off on Twitter about spouting their opinions. If you're a reporter, you should not be doing that, because that discredits, just like an editorial board undermines what the reporters write, that discredits you from the very beginning. And there are too many people that do that. It's just, I can't wrap my head around it.
Well, to that end, and I think we all know, again, we don't have to name names, but there are definite individuals who try to play the straight man shtick, and like act like this is just factual reporting. But factual reporting is, again, a regurgitation of things that just happened, whereas what we tend to see is that not only will they say, oh, well, this was said in a hearing, they're like, this was said in a hearing, this is the way it really is, and then point to some, fringe source. And like that's not even opinion journalism, that's just straight advocacy at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, much of the media has become advocates for whatever it is their pet issue, but it's good for me because that gives us a competitive advantage. But it's very frustrating to see, and I can imagine it would be very frustrating if I was working for a representative or a senator over there, and you see something like that happen that involves your boss. Mm-hmm. That would be the end of any time you talk to whatever reporter over at X outlet.
You mentioned earlier that one of the ways in which reporters show bias is the stories that they cover. Now, obviously, there are limitations; you can't cover everything, right. But so you try to cover as much to appear balanced. But it is one way that certainly certain outlets will show bias. But also the language they use in the stories themselves. Right, yeah. I mean, we've complained or talked about here, the Texas Tribune. I mean, during the entire election integrity debate over election reform, they called it voter suppression bills, voter suppression. Totally unjustified, never made it, never showed, where there was any voter suppression. In fact, it was the exact opposite if you actually looked at the research. And even since then, since the bills have been passed and we've had elections, there hasn't been any evidence of voter suppression, and yet they kept pushing this narrative over and over again. I won't ask you to comment on that other than to say, how much pressure do you feel choosing those words carefully? Like is it natural for you because, kind of what the line is in terms of how to describe these bills or describe these policies in a way that does cut down the center line? Or do you find yourself, I'm not assuming that you're left or right or whatever, do you find yourself having to go back and almost self-edit because you want to make sure that you're not using the coded language, so to speak, the dog whistle language kind of stuff in your own reporting?
I think as time has gone on, as I've done the job more, it's just come more naturally. But we have our own style guide, and a lot of it's based on the AP style guide, just as a basis. But then there are many things that are totally different. For example, the one I like to use a lot is gender-affirming care versus gender modification. We use the latter. All these other outlets use the former. And it, does not, in my opinion, does not describe the situation accurately, which first and foremost is what you should be striving for, right? But it's also tinged with a lot of bias, and it totally discounts the other opinion, the very real and substantial opposing opinion, right? And so you have to find these more neutral ways to describe things if they exist, which they almost always do if you try hard enough. But I don't see much of that, and it's quite concerning because you see something like this transgender treatment issue. It doesn't do the severity of the issue service if you're taking a side already with how you describe this situation, and it's a big problem.
Appreciate your reality affirming view.
Well, that's all the time that we have today. Again, we could talk about this for for a lot, because it's a big issue, and we do get a lot of folks, who want, a TPPF to take on kind of this, the leftist media and all of that. That's not really our, that's not really our lane necessarily. So definitely want to thank you for what you do and the creating the organization and then being there since the very beginning and doing what y'all do. Connie's gonna be very mad that I mistitled her, so I apologize for that to all our folks, to Connie and everyone else. But yes, please, if you're not familiar, I'm sure all of our listeners and watchers are, but the Texan.news, please go subscribe. It's a fantastic publication, and you put out daily stories. I mean, every single day you're putting out, particularly now during the legislature, to get that a worldview affirming or not contradicting approach to news. It's something that's very refreshing at the very least. So thank you for what you do. Brad, really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And for everybody else, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And as we always like to say, if I can get the quote right this time, Sam Houston said, "Do right and risk the consequences." We'll see you next time.